When Fighter Command reviewed sortie reports from RAF Kenley in September 1940, one name appeared with impossible frequency in confirmed kill credits: leading aircraftman Bernard Price, aged 42, station cook. Not a pilot, not a gunner, a cook. In 3 weeks, this balding, rotund man with flour-dusted hands had contributed to 9 confirmed Messerschmitt destructions, using a method so unorthodox that intelligence officers initially suspected clerical error. They were wrong. What Price discovered would challenge everything the Luftwaffe believed about British defences. 15th of August 1940, 13:47 hours. RAF Kenley, Surrey. The tannoy's wail cut through the clatter of pots in the station cookhouse as Bernard Price scraped burnt custard from an industrial-sized pan. The air raid warning meant 15 minutes, perhaps 20 if they were lucky, before the Messerschmitt Bf-109s screamed overhead, their Daimler-Benz engines howling like mechanical banshees. Outside, ground crews sprinted toward shelters. Pilots grabbed helmets and scrambled toward hurricanes that would be airborne in 4 minutes. But Bernard Price, whose knees were too arthritic for running and whose eyesight too poor for combat flying, simply dried his hands on his apron and watched through the cookhouse window. Fighter Command's predicament was brutally mathematical. Between 13th August and 15th August, RAF Kenley had lost 12 aircraft on the ground to low-level attacks. Not from bombing, which was expected, but from opportunistic strafing by Bf-109s that swept in after bomber formations departed. The fighters came in fast, 60 feet above the grass, cannon fire ripping through parked Hurricanes and Spitfires before British guns could depress low enough to engage. 12 aircraft destroyed, 14 ground crew killed, 17 wounded. The station's operational strength was bleeding away, not in glorious dogfights, but in mechanical slaughter, while machines sat helpless on dispersal points. The problem was infuriatingly simple. RAF doctrine positioned anti-aircraft weapons for high-altitude defense. Bofors guns angled skyward, Lewis gun posts oriented toward bomber formations at 12,000 feet. When Bf-109s came in low and fast, traversing mechanisms couldn't follow. By the time gunners corrected elevation, the German fighters had already passed, leaving burning aircraft in their wake. Wing Commander Thornhill had raged through 3 tactical meetings without solution. Repositioning guns meant leaving high-altitude approaches exposed. Installing additional low-level batteries required weapons that didn't exist. Factories were prioritizing frontline equipment, not experimental defensive configurations for secondary airfields. Bernard Price understood none of this strategic complexity. What he understood was waste. Every Hurricane destroyed on the ground represented 320 man-hours of production labor, 5,600 in materials, and 3 months' industrial output from Castle Bromwich. More importantly, it represented 1 fewer aircraft to protect London's 7 million civilians currently enduring nightly bombardment. Price had watched the Blitz consume the East End from Kenley's perimeter. The orange glow wasn't abstract strategy, it was human beings burning. On the morning of 16th of August, Price stood in the cookhouse doorway watching ground crews sweep cannon shell casings from the previous afternoon's strafing run. The Messerschmitts had destroyed 2 Hurricanes and killed Flight Sergeant Morrison, whose favorite meal had been Price's steak and kidney pudding every Thursday without fail. Morrison's body had been removed at dawn, but the bloodstain remained on the concrete, slowly fading under drizzle that turned Kenley's grass the color of old bruises. Price noticed something nobody else had considered important. The Messerschmitts came in fast, perhaps 300 miles per hour at treetop level, but their approach was constrained by geography. Kenley sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by Surrey hills, thick with oak and elm. German pilots approaching from the southeast consistently followed the same flight path, a shallow valley corridor that offered the flattest approach angle. They weren't choosing that path tactically, they were choosing it because deviating risked collision with terrain at 300 mph with minimal altitude margin. The approach was predictable. Price walked that corridor during his afternoon break, boots squelching through muddy grass, still rutted from tank traps, hastily abandoned when the invasion threat receded. He paced the distance, counted his steps, noted the sight lines. The corridor was 800 yards long, 40 yards wide, defined by tree lines on both sides. Any aircraft entering that corridor committed to straight-line flight for approximately 10 seconds, the time required to traverse the distance at typical strafing speed. 10 seconds of absolutely predictable trajectory. That evening, Price approached Squadron Leader Davies with a suggestion so preposterous that Davies initially assumed the cook had been sampling the medicinal brandy reserved for shaken pilots. Price's proposal was this: position personnel along the flight corridor with standard-issue rifles, firing not at the aircraft, but at the space the aircraft would occupy 1 second into the future. Not aimed fire in the traditional sense, but calculated volume fire along a predicted trajectory, essentially flying an aircraft through a pre-positioned curtain of bullets. Davies's initial response was dismissive. Rifle rounds against armored fighters? Impossible. But Price had done arithmetic on the back of a requisition form. A Lee Enfield rifle fired a .303 round at 2,440 feet per second. A BF-109 at 300 mph covered 440 feet per second. If riflemen fired at a point 440 feet ahead of the observed aircraft position, the aircraft would intercept the bullet's trajectory precisely 1 second later, provided the rifleman's timing was accurate. More importantly, Price had calculated volume. 30 riflemen positioned along an 800-yard corridor, each firing 10 aim shots during the aircraft's 10-second transit, would create 300 bullets distributed along the flight path. The BF-109's frontal cross-section was roughly 140 square feet. Probability mathematics suggested at least 15 bullet impacts per aircraft, not enough to guarantee destruction, but potentially enough to damage coolant systems, hydraulics, or injure the pilot. Davies escalated the suggestion to Wing Commander Thornhill, who convened an emergency meeting that included the station gunnery officer, intelligence liaison, and Flight Lieutenant Pemberton, a former mathematics instructor whose analytical mind Thornhill trusted. Pemberton reviewed Price's calculations and found them theoretically sound, though practically untested. The gunnery officer declared the scheme ludicrous. Trained anti-aircraft gunners struggled to achieve hits against fast-moving targets, and Price was proposing to accomplish the same task with riflemen shooting blind at empty air. But Thornhill was desperate. 12 aircraft lost, 14 dead. The Battle of Britain was being decided over southern England in brutal calculus. Whichever side ran out of fighters first would lose control of British airspace, and with it, the capacity to prevent invasion. If Kenley's operational strength continued degrading at current rates, the station would be combat ineffective within 3 weeks. Conventional solutions had failed. Thornhill authorized a trial with one condition: Price would organize and lead the riflemen personally. If the scheme succeeded, credit would be Price's. If it failed, responsibility would also be his. Price accepted without hesitation. 17th August 1940, 06:30 hours. Bernard Price assembled his volunteer force in the pre-dawn darkness with the methodical efficiency of a man who had spent 23 years organizing kitchen rotations and meal schedules for 400 personnel. The volunteers weren't elite soldiers. They were ground crew mechanics, clerks, drivers, radio operators, personnel classified as non-combat support, whose rifle training consisted of basic marksmanship courses completed years earlier and rarely practiced. Price had 32 volunteers. None believed the scheme would work. All volunteered because RAF Kenley was bleeding, and sitting idle while comrades died felt obscene. The equipment was laughably inadequate. Lee Enfield no. 4 rifles, 1930s vintage weapons designed for infantry combat, not anti-aircraft defense. Ammunition was standard 303 ball rounds, identical to what ground crew used for perimeter guard duty. No tracer rounds to observe trajectory, no specialized sighting equipment. Each rifleman received 100 rounds, enough for 10 strafing attacks if ammunition discipline held. The rifles themselves were temperamental. Price spent the first hour supervising inspections, rejecting 7 weapons with fouled barrels or suspect firing pins. In total war, even basic equipment maintenance became luxurious. The positioning required mathematical precision translated into physical markers. Price paced the corridor again, this time hammering wooden stakes into soggy ground every 25 yards. Each stake marked a firing position. Riflemen would be spaced to create overlapping fields of fire without risking crossfire casualties. Price had calculated that positioning riflemen in 2 staggered lines, one offset 15 yards from the other, would create a bullet density pattern resembling a 3-dimensional cone through which aircraft must fly. The lead element would fire at the approaching aircraft's predicted position. The rear element would fire at the departing aircraft's tail aspect, targeting engine components vulnerable to rear-angle attack. The training was brutally compressed. Price had 6 hours to transform cooks, clerks, and mechanics into a coordinated firing unit. The technique he taught contradicted everything military marksmanship traditionally emphasized. Forget aiming at the target. Forget adjusting for windage or elevation. Instead, observe the aircraft, count to 1, aim at the empty air where you estimate the aircraft will be, and fire. Then, immediately cycle the bolt and repeat. Speed mattered more than precision. Volume of fire would compensate for individual inaccuracy. Price drilled the sequence until it became mechanical. Observe, count, aim, fire, cycle, repeat. Over and over until exhausted men performed the sequence reflexively. The environmental conditions were miserable. Rain began at 8 hours and continued throughout the day, transforming Kenley's grass into treacherous mud that swallowed boots and made footing uncertain. Riflemen crouched in improvised trenches scraped from sodden earth, wearing greatcoats that grew heavier as rain saturated wool fabric. Visibility fluctuated as rain squalls swept across Surrey, reducing the corridor to grey obscurity. Price positioned observers at the corridor entrance with binoculars and field telephones connected to a central coordination point. The cookhouse, where Price would command operations while simultaneously managing meal preparation for 400 personnel who required feeding regardless of tactical experiments. The first test came at 13:22 hours. The tannoy wailed. Radar stations along the coast had detected a large formation approaching, Dornier bombers escorted by Bf-109s. The pattern was familiar. Bombers would target the airfield, Bf-109s would provide cover, then the fighters would sweep low on departure to strafe parked aircraft. Pilots scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns traversed toward high altitude, and 32 riflemen crouched in muddy trenches along the corridor, rain dripping from helmets, waiting. The bombers came first, droning overhead at 11,000 feet, black crosses visible against cloud. Beaufort's guns hammered, filling the air with shell bursts that looked like dirty cotton. Bombs fell. Whistling descent terminated by explosions that threw mud and grass skyward. One bomb struck the perimeter track, cratering concrete. Another destroyed a storage shed, sending wooden debris spiraling. Then the bombers turned south, engines fading. Silence descended, broken only by rain hissing against grass. The riflemen waited. At 13:31 hours, the observer telephoned. Aircraft approaching low from the southeast. Price grabbed his whistle. 3 short blasts, the signal. Riflemen raised weapons, aiming at nothing, at empty air 40 yards ahead of where eyes instinctively tracked. The sound arrived first. That distinctive Daimler-Benz howl, rising from a distant moan to mechanical scream. Then the shapes appeared. 3 Bf-109s in loose formation, canopy glass glinting dully, coming in fast and low, perhaps 50 feet above the grass. Price blew his whistle continuously. The firing signal. 32 rifles opened fire in ragged sequence, not a disciplined volley, but sustained crackling fire that sounded oddly insignificant against the engine roar. Price couldn't observe bullet trajectories, no traces, but he saw the Messerschmitts react. The lead aircraft suddenly pitched upward, nose rising sharply as the pilot instinctively evaded perceived threat. The sudden climb bled airspeed catastrophically at low altitude. The fighter staggered, wallowed, then dropped back toward Earth. The pilot recovered control barely 50 feet up, abandoning the strafing run entirely. The formation scattered, climbing steeply and departing without firing a single cannon round. No aircraft destroyed, but no British aircraft strafed either. Price called it a success. The riflemen, soaked and shaking with adrenaline, weren't certain what had just occurred. But they had fired, the Germans had fled, and nobody had died. For men accustomed to helplessly watching comrades burn, that represented victory. The second attack came at 16:45 hours, minutes before darkness. 4 Bf-109s approaching the same corridor. This time the riflemen fired with slightly more confidence, slightly better timing. One Messerschmitt broke formation trailing thin grey smoke, possibly coolant, possibly hydraulic fluid, impossible to confirm. The aircraft departed, but ground crew later found an oil slick on grass near the corridor's far end. Something had been hit. The third attack occurred on 18th of August. This time, 5 Bf-109s approached. The riflemen had refined their technique overnight, faster bolt cycling, better estimation of lead distance. The volume of fire was noticeably heavier. One Bf-109 dropped suddenly, nose down, and struck the ground 400 yards beyond the airfield perimeter with an impact that shook windows in the cookhouse. The explosion was visible from the control tower. Orange fireball rising above tree line, followed by black smoke column. The pilot did not survive. One confirmed kill. Price's impossible scheme had drawn blood. Wing Commander Thornhill authorized continuation. 22nd August 1940, Luftflotte to headquarters, Beauvais, France. Oberst Heinrich Kessler studied the intelligence summary with mounting frustration that hardened into disbelief. RAF Kenley, previously classified as a moderately defended secondary target, had suddenly become inexplicably lethal to low-level operations. Between 16th and 21st August, Jagdgeschwader 52 had lost 4 Bf-109s to unexplained ground fire during strafing runs, not anti-aircraft guns, which produced characteristic shell bursts and were easily identifiable, but something else. Pilots reported encountering intense small arms fire of unprecedented accuracy, appearing seemingly from nowhere along approach corridors. 3 pilots killed. 1 captured after crashing, unable to provide coherent explanation beyond they were shooting at air, not at us. The statement made no tactical sense. Kessler's operational doctrine presumed British defences would follow predictable patterns, anti-aircraft guns positioned for high-altitude interception, machine gun posts defending static installations, predictable, conventional, easily mapped and avoided. What his pilots were encountering at Kenley contradicted doctrinal expectations. The British appeared to be firing rifles, at attacking fighters, yet achieving hit rates comparable to trained anti-aircraft batteries. Impossible. Rifle fire against modern fighters was psychological nuisance, nothing more. The armoured Bf-109 could sustain dozens of rifle hits without critical damage, yet the aircraft were falling. Kessler reviewed crash investigations personally. The destroyed aircraft showed damage patterns inconsistent with anti-aircraft fragmentation. Instead, multiple small caliber punctures concentrated around engine cowlings, coolant systems, and cockpit areas. Bullet entry angles suggested ground-based fire, but the volume and accuracy implied coordinated battery action, not random rifle shots. One aircraft had sustained 17 separate bullet impacts within a 2-square-foot area, centered on the coolant radiator, damage that appeared almost impossibly concentrated for unguided fire. Kessler considered explanations. Perhaps the British had deployed concealed automatic weapons, Bren guns or similar, along approach routes. Reconnaissance flights were ordered, but revealed nothing unusual. Perhaps British intelligence had predicted approach corridors and positioned sharpshooters, but achieving coordinated fire from dispersed positions without radio communication seemed improbable. The most disturbing possibility was that British defensive doctrine had evolved in ways German intelligence had failed to anticipate. The implications were troubling. If secondary airfields like Kenley could improvise effective anti-aircraft defense using infantry weapons, the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage in attacking British airfields would erode rapidly. Kessler ordered tactical modification. Bf 109s approaching Kenley would avoid the southeast corridor entirely, instead approaching from the northwest, where terrain offered no obvious concealment for ground forces. The revised approach required longer flight time over hostile territory and provided less optimal strafing angles, but reduced exposure to whatever defensive innovation the British had implemented. 23 August 1940, 14:18 hours, RAF Kenley. Bernard Price anticipated the adaptation. The Germans weren't stupid. They would recognize the pattern and adjust. When observers reported aircraft approaching from the northwest instead of the southeast, Price was already repositioning riflemen. The new corridor was narrower, more constrained by terrain, but required only 15 minutes to reposition stakes and brief, adjusted firing coordinates. The riflemen had become efficient through repetition. They understood the technique now, had internalized the timing. 3 Bf 109s entered the northwest corridor at 14:31 hours. Price's riflemen engaged with disciplined fire. No panic, no hesitation. One Messerschmitt shed pieces mid-flight, debris spiraling behind the aircraft like mechanical confetti. The fighter maintained altitude briefly, then nosed over and dove into Surrey countryside 3 miles south. Confirmed kill number 5. Over the following week, the pattern repeated with mechanical inevitability. German fighters approached from varying directions, attempting to avoid predicted defensive positions. Price adapted with frustrating speed, repositioning riflemen sometimes twice daily as intelligence officers monitored German approach patterns. The riflemen became increasingly proficient. What had initially required conscious calculation, observe, count, aim ahead, fire, became instinctive. Volume of fire increased as confidence grew. By 29 August, RAF Kenley had recorded 9 confirmed Bf 109 destructions attributed to ground fire, with 4 additional aircraft observed departing trailing smoke or flying erratically. Bernard Price's name appeared in every after-action report. Intelligence officers interviewed him repeatedly, documenting the technique for potential replication at other stations. What had begun as desperate improvisation was becoming codified doctrine. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was unmeasurable but significant. Attacking Kenley had transformed from routine strafing operation into hazardous gamble. Pilots who previously approached British airfields with confidence now flew tense, scanning ground not for obvious gun emplacements, but for any indication of concealed riflemen. The fear was insidious. They weren't being targeted by visible threats they could avoid, but by invisible shooters firing at positions where aircraft would be rather than where aircraft were. It was like flying through a trap that existed simultaneously nowhere and everywhere. Flight Lieutenant Pemberton, observing from the control tower, later wrote in his diary, "Price has accomplished something remarkable. He hasn't changed our weapons or our resources. He's changed what the Germans believe is possible. They thought low-level attacks were safe. Now they know otherwise. Fear, more than bullets, has become our defense." On 31 August, German strafing attacks on RAF Kenley ceased entirely. Intelligence intercepts suggested Luftwaffe Command had reclassified the airfield as excessively dangerous for low-level operations, recommending pilots avoid ground attack profiles. The corridor that had cost 12 British aircraft now belonged to Bernard Price and his riflemen, ordinary men who had become, through necessity and innovation, an anti-aircraft battery equipped with nothing but rifles, arithmetic, and bloody-minded determination. 15th September 1940, 16 hours. The day would later be memorialized as Battle of Britain Day, the moment when Luftwaffe's final massive daylight assault broke against Fighter Command's defense, forcing German strategic recalculation. But for Bernard Price, standing in Kenley's cookhouse supervising preparation of 400 dinners, the significance was more personal. 9 confirmed kills, 4 probable additional destructions, 0 British aircraft lost to strafing attacks since 16th of August. The impossible had become routine. Wing Commander Thornhill had submitted Price's name for commendation. The language was carefully bureaucratic, for innovation in defensive tactics, resulting in significant enemy casualties and preservation of operational aircraft. But everyone at Kenley understood the substance. A cook with arthritic knees and poor eyesight had accomplished what trained anti-aircraft units could not, made low-level attack unacceptably dangerous using weapons already available and personnel already present. The strategic implications rippled outward. Air Ministry analysts reviewed Price's technique and authorized its replication across fighter command stations throughout southern England. The implementation varied. Some stations used riflemen. Others adapted the concept using machine guns or even shotguns for closer range interception. But the underlying principle remained constant. Create volume fire along predicted trajectories rather than attempting precision targeting of fast-moving aircraft. By October 1940, 14 RAF stations had implemented variations of Price's corridor, as the technique was informally known. Collectively, these improvised defenses were credited with destroying or damaging an estimated 47 German aircraft and preventing strafing destruction of approximately 60 British fighters that would otherwise have been lost on the ground. The mathematical elegance appealed to analytical minds within RAF leadership. Price had essentially transformed the problem from three-dimensional aerial combat, requiring complex prediction of moving target trajectories, into one-dimensional interception along a fixed corridor. By constraining the battlefield to predictable geography and timing, Price had reduced complexity to manageable calculation. The innovation wasn't technological, it was conceptual. He had changed how the RAF thought about defensive fire. For the riflemen themselves, the experience had been transformative in quieter ways. Ground crew mechanics who had felt helpless watching aircraft burn now possessed agency. They had fought back, not with specialized equipment or elite training, but with standard rifles and stubborn arithmetic. Several later transferred to aircrew positions, carrying with them confidence born from discovering that ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary results when necessity demanded. Flight Sergeant Davies, one of Price's original volunteers, later wrote, "Before Price, we were victims waiting for bombs. After Price, we were defenders." That change in identity mattered more than the Germans ever realized. The German perspective, reconstructed from post-war interviews and captured documents, revealed deep institutional confusion. Luftwaffe intelligence had categorized British airfield defenses according to established classifications: heavy anti-aircraft batteries, light anti-aircraft guns, machine gun positions. What Price had created fit no existing classification. It was improvised, adaptive, and employed weapons considered obsolete for anti-aircraft purposes. German tactical planning relied on predictable British adherence to doctrinal norms. When those norms were violated through creative desperation, Luftwaffe responses became hesitant and ineffective. Oberst Kessler, interrogated in 1946, acknowledged the perplexity. "We assumed the British would defend as we would defend, with specialized equipment, rigid procedures, hierarchical command. Instead, they use cooks and mechanics with rifles. How does one plan against that?" You cannot predict improvisation. The statement captured something fundamental about Britain's wartime experience. The nation survived 1940 not through material superiority. Germany possessed more aircraft, more troops, more industrial capacity, but through willingness to discard conventional thinking when conventional thinking had failed. Price himself received the British Empire Medal in November 1940. The presentation ceremony was modest, held at Kenley with assembled station personnel. Wing Commander Thornhill noted in his citation, "Leading aircraftman Price exemplifies the qualities that will secure victory: ingenuity, determination, and refusal to accept defeat when solutions remain undiscovered." Price's response was characteristically understated. "I simply did what seemed logical. The Germans were predictable. We made their predictability a vulnerability." Post-war, Price returned to civilian life, managing a bakery in Croydon. He spoke rarely of his wartime service, uncomfortable with the notion that his contributions were exceptional. To him, the arithmetic had been obvious. Yet, military historians studying the Battle of Britain consistently cite Price's innovation as exemplifying British adaptive capacity during the crisis period. The technique itself became obsolete as aircraft speeds increased and tactics evolved, but the principle that ordinary personnel using ordinary weapons could achieve extraordinary results through innovative application became embedded in RAF training doctrine. In 1952, the RAF Staff College incorporated Price's corridor as a case study in tactical innovation under resource constraint. The lesson wasn't the specific technique, but the underlying methodology. Identify enemy patterns, exploit geographical constraints, apply volume rather than precision when precision proves unattainable. Price attended one such lecture, sitting anonymously in the back row, listening to academic analysis of decisions he had made instinctively while scraping burnt custard from pots. Perhaps the most significant legacy was psychological. Price had proven that the Battle of Britain was fought not only by the few, the celebrated fighter pilots whose courage was unquestionable, but also by countless ordinary individuals who refused to accept helplessness. Cooks, clerks, mechanics, people whose names never appeared in newspapers but whose contributions shaped outcomes. Price's 9 kills represented far more than mathematical tallies. They represented validation that in total war, everyone fights, and innovation matters more than equipment. On 15th of September 1965, the 25th anniversary of Battle of Britain Day, Price was invited to a commemorative event at RAF Kenley, now preserved as a memorial site. He stood at the edge of the southeast corridor, now overgrown with brambles and wildflowers, and remarked to a journalist, "We were terrified, of course, but we were also angry. The Germans thought they could simply destroy us. We proved them wrong using rifles and arithmetic. That's worth remembering, not because we were heroes, but because we were ordinary people who refused to quit. Britain survived because enough ordinary people made that same choice." Bernard Price died in 1979, aged 81. His obituary in the Times mentioned his wartime service in a single paragraph. But among RAF veterans who served at Kenley during August 1940, his name remained synonymous with the stubborn creativity that characterized Britain's finest hour, the refusal to accept impossible, the determination to find solutions where none apparently existed, and the quiet courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things because their nation required it. If this story of wartime ingenuity and British resilience moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold tales from the Second World War. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you know of other unsung heroes whose innovations changed the course of history? Help us honor their memory by sharing this story. Thank you for watching, and remember, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when courage meets creativity.